in every instance, it was the Americans who broke the ceasefire. Iran never fired at Americans. It was Americans who fired at Iran. The fact that Iran struck tankers is because those tankers were defying the Iranian Navy and moving through a corridor that was not approved of by the Iranians. And in accordance with the MOU signed between Iran and the United States, the Iranians are to provide the security and the environment for ships to pass through until the situation becomes normal, as for as long as the MOU is valid. So those ships were being and for many days, ships were being uh, taken in and out of the Persian Gulf through a corridor established by the United States. So the United States itself was undermining the MOU because, according to the MOU, the United States does not play a role in transportation or shipping through the Strait of Hormuz during this period of time. And this is just one of the US violations. The United States has failed to give Iran its stolen assets. It has reimposed the sanctions on Iranian oil. It refuses to force the Israeli regime to leave Lebanon and to stop the killing. Uh, we just saw the day before yesterday, two more Lebanese citizens were murdered. The day before, three were murdered, including a school principal and her husband and their maid. Um, so the violations from the American side are many, and we were expecting that from the beginning. We've discussed this before. Iran never thought that the Americans were going to abide by the MOU willingly. The Iranians basically signed the MOU uh, because it wanted to be able to transport its oil and import goods uh, during this period of time that the MOU is um, is is in place. And if the Americans choose to abide by other provisions of the MOU, the Iranians will also be more cooperative in opening the Strait of Hormuz. But if the Americans are not going to abide by their commitments in the MOU, then the Iranians are not going to uh, carry out their obligations. It's not a one sided affair. The experience of Iran uh, with regards to the JCPOA was, I think, very key in the way in which the MOU was constructed. Back then, the Iranians carried out their obligations and the Americans didn't. And the Iranians were chasing after the Americans and constantly telling them that you're not abiding by your commitments, and the Americans didn't care. So this time around, the Iranians have basically um, created an architecture within which, if the Americans do not comply, the Iranians will not comply. If the Americans comply, the Iranians comply. That's basically how it is. So the Americans can't expect to be allowed to open a corridor, which goes against, I think, Article 5 of the MOU, and expect Iran to let them to get away with it. Because if Iran does that, then the Americans will go further and further, and they'll undermine everything. If the Americans think that they can refuse Iran from having access to its stolen assets, they're mistaken because the Iranians know how to punish the Americans as well through the leverage that they have in the Strait of Hormuz. So everything depends on the Americans. The more the Americans cooperate, the more ships flow through the Strait of Hormuz. The less the Americans cooperate and the less honest they are about their commitment to the MOU, the less ships pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, in addition to that, there will be no negotiations about Iran's nuclear program and the sanctions regime, because Iran has made the precondition to that the implementation of the first phase of the MOU. And when the Americans are not implementing the first phase of the MOU, that means that there's no reason to negotiate or agree upon anything for the second phase. So this agreement, although it is flawed, I mean, I think I've said this to you off the record. During the 39-day war, I was advocating for Iran to continue fighting for a few more days. And during the siege warfare, and after the MOU was being negotiated, I was advocating for Iran to wait a couple more weeks. Why? Because I felt that the shortage of energy was that this was the Achilles heel of Trump, and that if we just waited a bit more, it would have strengthened our hand. But in any case, the Iranian, I mean, this is not a bad deal. As I said, the Iranians were very smart, and they had lots of tankers full of oil, which they swiftly sent to their Asian markets, because Iran has to feed well over 90 million people, and it has to bring in supplies. I mean, people can speak idealistically about, continuing warfare, but you do have to, you have to run the country, you have to run the armed forces, you have to support the axis of resistance. This costs money. So at the end of the day, the Iranians agreed to a deal which was favorable to Iran, because the Iranians did have patience. Again, I thought we should be a bit more patient, but they showed patience, and they forced Trump to accept a deal that was favorable to Iran. It could have been better, but it was still favorable to Iran. Everyone in the West says it was a capitulation. That's why Trump went out and admitted that they only had 4 more weeks of energy supplies. But in any case, the United States has not been able to replace all that lost the lost supply, the supplies that are absent on the market. When it comes to oil, there is still a huge shortage. When it comes to other products that come out of petrochemical products and other products that come out of the Strait of Hormuz, there's a huge shortage, and that has not been reversed. And so the Iranians know that if the Americans escalate and start a new war, and no fuel and no petrochemicals leave the Strait of Hormuz, the United States is going to be in severe trouble. So it's really up to the United States to make a decision. Do they want to crash their own economy and the global economy by not adhering to the provisions of the MOU? Do they think that they can just get away with it like the JCPOA? I mean, it's different, and Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz is what makes it entirely different. So the smart thing for the Americans to do is to adhere to their commitments. Do I think they're going to do it? No. Well, I think you and I have discussed this many times over the past few weeks. I don't think they're ever going to willingly do it. But the Iranians are going to see how much the leverage that they have will force them to make a move. I mean, at the end of the day, they lifted the siege because they had to.
Yeah. Here is what J.D. Vance said about the
Oh,
situation.
by the way, Nima, sorry for just one thing. The clip that you showed showing Iranian Air Force jets, that's just another indication of all the nonsense that Trump has been saying about destroying Iran's Air Force. And Iran's key assets are all very well protected, as we've seen with the drone and missile programs. Everything that is of great sensitivity was taken underground, and those bases have been built for these circumstances. And since the ceasefire, the Iranians have been expanding their underground bases and expanding their missile and drone program, and using new technologies for their defense capabilities. But these jets that were flying over Mashhad to protect the crowd are an indication that what Trump says is just nonsense.
Yeah. Let me play a clip of J.D. Vance talking about the situation between Iran and the United States.
We came into the situation with maximum leverage and maximum strength. Their nuclear program was destroyed. Their conventional military was destroyed. And you've got some people within the Iranian system who are saying, you know what? We want to change our relationship with the United States. We want to turn over a new leaf. And the president said, okay, we will sit down at the table and negotiate and see if the smart people in that system can take over from the crazy people. Well, here's the basic deal that we cut. The basic deal that we cut was, we'll lift our blockade if you stop shooting at ships. But if you shoot at ships, we are going to punch back, and we're going to punch back harder than ever before. That was the deal. They said they would stop shooting at ships. And what happened 24 hours ago? They started shooting at ships again. Now, they were good. They were well behaved for about a week, but then they started shooting at ships. So the deal is very simple. If they shoot at ships, we're going to knock the hell out of them, and it's that simple, and that's the basic way it's going to work.
So the question is, why did you start shooting the ships?
I think what this shows is that those boats in the Caribbean that were supposedly taking drugs that they blew up were not taking drugs, and the drugs are still getting to the United States because he's obviously using something. No, that's not what the deal was. First of all, they lost the war, and they lost the siege war. And everyone who has seen in the West, who has seen the MOU, know that it's not favorable to the United States. In fact, in Iran, many people are saying we should have been tougher at the negotiating table, and we should have taken more concessions because the Americans were weak. And I don't disagree with that. But I don't think it's a bad deal. But I think it could have been better. But that's beyond the point. I digress. So in this deal, the Americans have commitments, and so do the Iranians. The Iranians are the ones who are to normalize the security situation in the Strait of Hormuz. And they are the ones who are to normalize commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. What the Americans tried to do in violation of the MOU was to establish their own corridor. They couldn't do that during the war, and they couldn't do that during siege warfare. And Iran did not allow them to get that concession in the MOU. So it was Iran that was responsible for dealing with security matters and normalization in the Strait of Hormuz. And it's Article 5. Everyone can read it. So what the United States did was that they opened their corridor and then started encouraging ships to go through that and to ignore the Iranians. And the Iranians, for days, kept warning ships not to do this and warned the Americans to stop. For many days. And people like myself were saying that we shouldn't allow this to happen. And the armed forces, the government, the state, after much delay, I don't know if I'm disconnected or connected. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. So after much delay, in my opinion, they finally struck a number of ships that were intentionally using the American corridor and ignoring the Iranian armed forces. So it's the responsibility of the United States, and it's the responsibility of those ship owners that were literate enough to understand what was in the MOU and to understand the warnings that were given repeatedly and over many days by the Iranian armed forces.
Yeah. Just moments ago, IRGC announced that they hit 10 targets in Jordan, or at least 10 ballistic missiles hit the targets in Jordan. This is the latest news, Professor Marandi. And when it comes to the MOU, he's talking about the ships. Yesterday, we learned from, the military advisor of the Supreme Leader of Iran, Mohsen Rezai. He said that the United States is using warships in this raid. They're trying to use the warships, which is based on MOU, this is the red line on the part of Iranians. It's all about the commercial vessels, commercial ships, nothing of the military sort of operation in this strait.
Yes, the Americans have been carrying out a military operation in an area that does not belong to them. It is the Strait of Hormuz is not international waters, and the MOU is clear about Iran being responsible for security and for normalizing shipping. And it didn't have to be like this. The Americans could have easily had normal shipping gradually uh, take place through the Strait of Hormuz if they just adhered to their commitments in the MOU. All the Americans had to do was stay out of the Strait of Hormuz, let the Iranians carry out their obligations, hand over Iranian stolen assets, and tell the Israelis to leave Lebanon. It's a sovereign and independent country. And shipping through the Strait of Hormuz would have been normalized. But they chose not to do that because that's how the Americans work. They sign a piece of paper, and then for them, the other side must abide by its commitments, but they don't have to. The Americans don't have to abide by their commitments. It's always the other side that has to do so. And Iran is not like the other countries that the United States deals with. Iran is not going to accept that. And it is willing to go to war. So when Trump threatens to murder us, to destroy us, to send us back to the Stone Age, the Iranians respond and say, we're not moving, we're not budging. So this is a crisis that Trump has created from the very beginning, and he is worsening the crisis because the energy shortage, as I said earlier, has continues to be a threat to the global economy. And I think that the longer this crisis in the Strait of Hormuz continues, the closer we get to a global economic catastrophe. And the shortages have already been created for over the past 4.5 months now. All it needs is a few more weeks, and it'll be catastrophic for everyone.
Yeah, New York Times reported that the U.S. forces struck over 170 Iranian military targets in the past 2 days, and this was reported, just came out from New York Times. And the other point is
let me at this point explain something. We shouldn't take this very literally and at face value. Many of the things that they struck have absolutely no significance. First of all, they've struck many decoys, and as they did during the war. The Iranians have decoys everywhere. Most of the things that are out there are decoys. Second of all, Iran's assets are mostly underground. They only bring them out when necessary. So most of what Iran had, when they say that they destroyed Iran's drone depots are deep underground. So there are no depots on the ground. They've been, if they were going to destroy our depots, they would have done it during the 40 days of war. So what they do basically is like a piece of metal that was put there to launch a drone. Uh, the Iranians leave it and go back, and they go and bomb that piece of metal. That doesn't do any damage to the Iranian armed forces. That's a piece of metal that can be replaced in 2 minutes. So by destroying decoys and pieces of metal and civilian infrastructure, by bombing people's boats, that's not destroying. They can pretend that these are all ships and speedboats that belong to the Revolutionary Guards. But anyone who looks at the images can see that these are mostly boats that belong to ordinary people. And the Americans know that. But they don't care about ordinary people, just like they attack the railway and the bridge near Mashhad in the northeastern of Iran. The Americans are very comfortable with carrying out war crimes. And so what I'm saying is basically we shouldn't take anything that they say seriously. Iranian assets are well protected; they're deep underground. And the Americans were saying the same thing for 40 days during the war, and then after the war, gradually the information came out from the New York Times and the Washington Post to a degree that what we were saying beforehand was all true. We were saying that no, Iran's missiles and drones were not damaged. And then weeks later, after the war, the Americans themselves admit that, yes, we are right.
As you see in the picture, is not the speedboats that were attacked in this photo that came out just 2 hours ago. It shows that those boats that are used for fishing or something like some sort of activities by civilians.
And they know it. And they know it. No one should imagine for a moment that the Americans got it wrong. No, that was intentional.
Yeah. And IRGC, the statement of IRGC says Iran has secured and partially reopened the Strait of Hormuz, bringing traffic back to about 50% of pre-war levels, with ships needing IRGC Navy permission to pass through Iranian designated routes. Yeah. And it says that foreigners have no share in this land and in the Strait of Hormuz. It warns that the United States has no right to interfere in Hormuz traffic routes, and any American adventurism will face a harsh response and could disrupt the reopening, harming countries that rely on the strait. Do you think that if the escalations continue and maybe the blockade, because we've learned that Iran overnight, at least from the reports that we've learned from Tanker Tracker, it says more than 10 million barrels were exported overnight last night because Iran was fearing the blockade of the United States. Do you see the blockade happening or Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz? What would be that condition? Iran is going to close the Strait of Hormuz, or they're going to wait for the United States to see what the United States is going to do? They're going to come out with the blockade and Iran is going to respond to that.
Well, we have to always remember that Iran never closed the Strait of Hormuz. And it was always open, even during the fighting, during the war, the hot war. Ships that were not from countries that were hostile towards Iran, they would pass through the strait. So Chinese ships, Russian ships, we saw Pakistani ships or Indian ships or Bangladeshi ships and so on. Japanese ships even, they would pass through the strait. The countries that were involved in war against Iran, like the Saudis, the Emiratis, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, in the Persian Gulf, they were the ones who were not allowed to use the strait for obvious reasons. They were waging war against Iran. In fact, last night and the night before, the United States was using their airspace. It was using their bases. It was using their assets to strike Iran. So these 5 countries are involved. Qatar, deeply involved. Kuwait, deeply involved. Saudi Arabia, all of them. So, but even now, like in the past, Iran has not shut the Strait of Hormuz. But it will not allow the Americans to control the strait. That was something that Iran made clear. It was the Americans that effectively shut the Strait of Hormuz when they imposed the siege. But even then, Iran allowed ships from countries that were friendly, except for on days when there was heavy fighting, to leave the strait. So right now, the Iranians have not shut down the strait. But if the Americans impose a siege, then that will change things. Then the flow of traffic will go down immensely, and the global economic crisis will become more imminent.
Here is the new footage, Professor Marandi, coming out and showing that the same thing, proving what you've just said about the Americans hitting the civilian boats in close to the Strait of Hormuz. Yeah, here you see the new footage that shows that they hit the civilian boats. And do you think, Professor Marandi, that with the new activities that are happening, because we had some reports that Iran is sending forces to the Iraqi border, and it seems that there are some sort of activities on the part of the Iraqi Kurdistan. Can you hear me, Professor Marandi?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. And even we had Iran, one of the Iranian commanders talking about making a buffer zone, a security zone at the border with Iraqi Kurdistan. Is that going to happen? And how serious is that for Iran?
I don't know. I don't know if that's going to happen or if that's just a threat to make sure that the Iraqi government enforces its authority, and so that the Kurdish government in the northern Iraq enforces its authority over the border area, because these terrorist groups have bases alongside the border, and the Iraqi government knows this, and the Kurdish government in Erbil knows this quite well. The Americans fund them, the Europeans support them, the Israelis, of course, help them, and they are tolerated by these authorities. So the Iranians are striking them nowadays, as we've seen during the last few months. They've been striking them with missiles, but mostly drones. And now I think that this is a threat that either should be taken seriously, or that it may be enforced, or that it's basically for now an attempt to push the Kurdish authorities in northern Iraq to bring an end to the presence of these organized terrorists alongside its borders. So it may be that Iran is planning to carry this out, or it may be that the Iranians are saying this to make sure that they change to force them to change their policy, but that if they don't do so, then they may move in. That's what, unlike Turkey, which has bases all over Iraq and